The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr President. I lead for the opposition on this legislation, and I indicate at the outset that the opposition does not oppose the measures the bill proposes. It's a matter of record that over the next 10 to 15 years, most of the electricity that we use today that comes from coal-fired power stations will retire, and obviously we will need to significantly increase the investment and construction and development and implementation of new renewable energy generating projects if we are to have the level of energy supply and security that we have today, and indeed if we're to have any chance of bringing skyrocketing power bills down, that will definitely need to take place. But as the sources of our power become increasingly renewable, and of course the predominant forms of renewables being wind and solar are intermittent in nature, there will be the need for firming technologies, and the most developed and reliable form of storage that is readily dispatchable is, of course, pumped hydro. It is something like 97% of the world's stored energy is in the form of pumped hydro. And of course, it's a matter of record that the proposed Snowy Hydro 2.0 is a massive potential source of and stored energy, which will provide security not just for New South Wales, but for Australia more generally. We don't know whether the proposal will go forward because, as the Minister has indicated, it's not just a matter of having new energy sources built and connected to the grid. There are also issues to do with whether the transmission system can accommodate the new supply. And of course, Snowy Hydro falls into this category. I think it's a matter of engineering and it's a matter of record that in order to be able to get the value for the community that Snowy Hydro may represent, there will need to be upgrades to the transmission system to get the energy out of where it is physically located. The opposition, of course, supports the transition away from a fossil fuel-based economy to one based on renewable energies, but to make that more than an aspiration, projects like Snowy Hydro 2.0 will need to be realised, because if Snowy Hydro 2.0 cannot, for reasons of geotechnical considerations or cost or what have you, if that cannot be realised, obviously there will need to be examined other pumped hydro possibilities. And I note that Professor Andrew Blakers of the ANU participated in a study that identified 22,000 potential sites across Australia and nearly 9,000 sites here in New South Wales for potential pumped hydro sites. So while Snowy 2.0 represents a significant opportunity to secure additional energy supply and security, it may not be the only way forward, but the opposition certainly won't do anything to stand in the way of exploring whether this can be made a reality. The Minister, in his second reading speech, made the point that this project, if it is realised, will add nearly 2,000 megawatts of firm dispatchable energy to the national electricity market, which is equivalent to around 14% of our peak energy demand here in New South Wales. If constructed, it would be the third largest individual generator after Araring and Bayswater coal-fired power stations. So we certainly won't do anything that gets in the way of this project, and that is why we will not oppose it. In terms of what the bill does in particular, it will enable leases and other approvals needed for the construction and operation of Snowy 2.0 to be granted under the National Parks and Wildlife legislation, subject of course to the project being approved under the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act. And this is needed, it is said, because the National Parks and Wildlife legislation does not contemplate power generation as a purpose for which a lease can be granted. Under the legislation, the Minister for the Environment can consider the objects of the National Parks and Wildlife Act, the management principles for national parks and others matters when negotiating the terms of any lease and other approvals and when considering what conditions to impose. There's also a regulation-making power to allow for the modification of the plan and lease-making provisions of the National Parks and Wildlife Act. And the bill also gives the government a right to seek an indemnity from companies if any compensation is payable in relation to native title, but does not affect in any way the operation of Commonwealth native title legislation. I note that the Green Party has some concerns about the scope of the legislation and has or will have some amendments that deal with those concerns. Obviously, we will listen closely to the debate about the rationale underpinning those amendments. I apprehend that at least some of them we will support. But with those observations, I note that the Honourable Penny Sharp will make a contribution and deal with some of the issues also raised by the bill. But with those short remarks, I can indicate the opposition won't be opposing the legislation.
Further speak.